Hello, and welcome to today's video. It concerns modern politics, an area I would normally choose to avoid. But in our present climate, many events of a political nature have an impact on archaeology. And so for this reason, I'm going to make a comment of my own and discuss some of the scenes we have witnessed from June 2020 onwards. A series of protests around the world following the tragic death of George Floyd in the USA has led to the reassessment of our past. Many statues have been boarded up or pulled down. Films, TV shows have been removed from streaming services, and companies producing famous brands have agreed to calls for their imagery or names to be changed. The reason for this reassessment is due to the racism these modern films, TV shows and brands have shown, or at least the perceived racism they have shown. Yet in the case of statues of past citizens, this reassessment has come due to the association these individuals had with slavery. In particular, the North Atlantic slave trade that existed from the 16th to the 18th centuries. As I'm from the UK, my sparse knowledge of American history does not allow me to comment on the situation there, so this video will largely look at the implications for Britain and British history. The British Empire played a major role in the kidnap, trafficking and enslavement of an enormous number of people. There is little point in citing the exact number here because these are estimations that are still much debated. However, the impact goes beyond the number of people who were enslaved. It affected the families of the kidnapped people who were left behind. The trauma of those who were not taken and were left behind, knowing that they had lost a loved one or loved ones, is something that rarely gets mentioned, and as we have always focused on the people that were taken and enslaved themselves. Whatever way you look at this, the actions of those building an empire looking to earn a profit were heinous crimes. The reassessment is therefore justified, and past crimes should be recognised rather than ignored. Past crimes can indeed be prosecuted, as the war crimes tribunals for the Second World War at Nuremberg and in The Hague for the Yugoslavian War show. Yet historical crimes are incredibly hard to assess and reevaluate, which is especially the case when trying to understand a person's intentions, views, opinions and actions. We cannot interrogate the individuals that were involved in the slave trade as they are no longer living. The further back you go in time, the harder this becomes. We cannot hope to fully understand a person's actions in the 1700s, especially if we judge them by today's standards. However, this does not in itself deny the clear historical tragedy that was the North Atlantic slave trade. Yet someone is, and in this case was, a product of their times, and what was normal at the time needs to be taken into account and recognised as an important part of the context of slavery. Barack Obama has mentioned the phrase, to be on the right side of history, on more than one occasion. For example, praising Angela Merkel in 2016 for doing the right thing during the migrant crisis. This phrase has since been evoked in June 2020 in response to the Black Lives Matter protests, and how the reassessment of our past in the Western world is on the right side of history. But who decides what the right side of history is, and how do we as humans, as in all of humanity, go about dealing with our history that is problematic? These questions will be examined today and in further videos, and although I do not hope to offer all of the answers, I hope to show ways forward that may allow such a reassessment to occur in a peaceful way. But with statues being our focus, we should first examine what statues and sculpted monuments are, how they are used, and for what reasons. Statues are an important part of our urban landscape. They are often connected to the idea of collective memory. They can be erected for many different reasons. They can be erected to gods as symbols of devotion, such as to the Buddha seen here, as symbols of beauty, as the pinnacle of human art and achievement, which Michelangelo's David is an often cited example. They can be erected to commemorate victory and courage, as the Iwo Jima sculptural group here shows us. Statues can function as symbols of freedom, and the Statue of Liberty is probably the most famous example in the world of this sentiment and value. The largest statue in the world is found in India. It is 182 metres or 597 feet high, and as a colossal figure of Sardar Patel, who was India's first deputy prime minister after its independence, it shows us how statues can celebrate and commemorate famous and important citizens. While statues of royalty have long been erected in European cities, statues can also be used to celebrate great political acts, such as the assassination of a tyrant, as the Harmodius and Aristogeiton group in this picture demonstrates. These two men assassinated the Athenian tyrant Hipparchus, who had gained too much power over the ancient city and had imposed a regime that severely limited the freedom of its citizens. In Budapest, Hungary, the Memento Park is an open-air museum to the communist history of the country and features statues of Lenin, Marx, and various dedications to communist ideals that no longer speak for the people of modern Hungary. These sculptures represent a memorial of a past historical period many people would prefer to forget. These statues therefore help people to both remember and to forget. Statues have been carved and then displayed in public since prehistory, and all cultures around the world at different times have produced them. In ancient times, mainly gods received statues, but pharaohs and Hellenistic rulers used them for propaganda purposes, to spread messages of their power. The most famous example of this in ancient Rome is Augustus's Prima Porta statue, which in the city of Rome was then replicated and installed in other cities across the Roman Empire from the late 1st century BC to the early 1st century AD. However, when connected to the memory of an individual who has been reassessed, the destruction of an image and the removal of the memory of that person is the act of Damnatio Memoriae. The most famous of this concerns Geta. He was the son of the Roman Emperor Septimus Severus, who allowed both of his sons to be joint rulers. However, his older brother Caracalla didn't get on with Geta and eventually had him killed. This led to the erasing of all images of Geta through what is called Damnatio Memoriae, or the damning of one's memory. However, we do know what he looked like from his images on coins which have survived. The Severantondo painting, which is now in Berlin, dates from the period of the erasing and shows that Geta's face has been fully removed. His memory has been erased, wiped out. The other main form of removal of statues comes under the rubric of iconoclasm. The definition you see on the screen here tells us that it is an act of rejecting or destroying religious images that are seen as heretical. Although it is mainly associated with religion, the definition we are using here shows it also refers to the destruction of political images, but also assertively rejecting cherished beliefs, institutions, values and practices. Nearly every culture on earth appears to have gone through some form of iconoclasm. Let us go through a brief history of some examples here. The Egyptians underwent phases of iconoclasm with the pharaoh Akhenaten overseeing the change to the new god Aten. During this period there was intolerance towards the traditional gods and many temples were destroyed. However, after his death, all public references to Akhenaten were also themselves destroyed. The Romans, as we have seen, enacted Damnatio Memoriae on individuals who became politically incorrect, so to speak. Yet there are also cases of Damnatio Memoriae being enacted on Roman statues by the people they conquered around the empire. The bronze head of Claudius found in the River Alde at Rendham near Saxmundham, Suffolk, is an example of this. It is quite likely to have been removed from the Temple of Claudius at Colchester and thrown into the river after the Boudiccan revolt in the province of Britannia in AD 60-61. During the later Roman period, Christians destroyed statues of Greek, Roman and Egyptian gods under Constantine's process of Christianization. As a brief digression here, we can link Christian destruction of statues to the destruction of one of the most famous buildings in antiquity, the Library of Alexandria in Egypt. This library was famous across the ancient world due to the vast number of papyrus scrolls it held. These scrolls were of such importance that Alexandria came to be regarded as the capital of knowledge and learning in the ancient world. The Library of Alexandria was part of a large complex of buildings called the Museion, dedicated to the Muses, the 9 goddesses of the arts. The Museion was a research centre of a mathematical and philosophical nature. The whole complex was destroyed by the conquering Muslim army of Amir ibn al-As in AD 642, so any trace of the library was finally gone by the 7th century AD. But this final act followed a series of destructive acts the Romans themselves had caused. For example, the Roman army under Caesar damaged scrolls in the library in their siege of 48 BC. The area of the city where the library was located was severely damaged, and possibly the library itself was too, during the siege of AD 272 by the Emperor Aurelian's forces, and then again during the Emperor Diocletian's siege of AD 297. These 2 sieges most probably destroyed the library itself, but the research institutes in the buildings of the Museion lived on in a new building called the Serapeum. The Serapeum was an important locus of philosophy, and one Neoplatonic school was led by Hypatia, a woman who was a true pioneer in terms of her mathematical and astronomical knowledge and skills. Such skills were dangerous, and many Christians were suspicious of Hypatia. This suspicion eventually led to the destruction of the Serapeum by the Christians in AD 391, and Hypatia was later murdered in AD 415. Popular belief has it that the library was destroyed by the Christians who murdered Hypatia, which is the erroneous image given to us in the film Agora, starring the delectable Rachel Weisz. However, the library was destroyed much earlier and was not likely connected to any act of iconoclastic vandalism. A much earlier act of vandalism can be seen in the case of the Athenian Acropolis and the destruction of its monuments by the Persian army in the late 5th century BC. The Athenians and other Greeks had refused to submit to the Persian Empire's demands for earth and water. The Persians saw this as an act of defiance by a weaker enemy that needed to be taught a lesson, and so they burnt the Acropolis to the ground. This act was a disaster for the Athenians. In his 8th book, Herodotus tells us that the city was under siege from the Achaemenid army of Xerxes I, the Persian king. When the city eventually fell, Xerxes ordered all of the temples and religious buildings to be razed to the ground. Many statues were plundered and taken away. Others were vandalised. Many have since been found in pits which have been excavated by archaeologists. These pits are known collectively by the German name Perserschutt, or Persian rubble. They represent the ceremonial burying of these objects by the ancient Athenians, who, angered at the destruction of their city and disrespect to their gods, vowed vengeance against the Persian Empire. The Greco-Persian wars that followed can be discussed at another time, in another video. The Athenians first rebuilt their city, and in the image here we can see the foundations of the original temples under the much later buildings that still survive to this day. Furthermore, in the other pictures presented here, we can see how columns of the archaic temple were reused in the building of the new defensive walls of Athens. The need for vengeance left an indelible mark on the ancient Greeks, who never fully trusted the Persians as a result. Around 150 years later, Alexander the Great returned the favour when the Persian capital Persepolis was burnt to the ground. Scholars still debate to this day whether the fire was an accident or a deliberate act of revenge for the burning of the Athenian Acropolis. Yet there is an interesting degree of circularity here. Once one culture has been damaged by another, and this event stays in the collective memory of that people, revenge becomes simply an inevitable formality. Returning to more modern examples, the Protestant Reformation in Christianity led to the sacking of churches and the destruction of religious icons. Many important sacred objects were lost, and merely because one set of Christians disagreed with another. During the American Revolution and Wars of Independence, the Sons of Liberty pulled down the gilded lead equestrian statue of King George III in Bowling Green, New York. This statue had been erected in 1770 with the king dressed in the style of the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius. The statue was immediately the focus of attacks of vandalism. These attacks increased so much that New York passed an anti-graffiti law to curb the protests against the king. When the Declaration of Independence was read to Washington's troops on the 9th of July 1776, the Sons of Liberty toppled the statue of King George III, as can be seen here in this painting. The Cultural Revolution in China under Mao Zedong during 1966 to 1976 was a period of intense Damnatio Memoriae. The period before this had seen the failure of the policies of the so-called Great Leap Forward, an economic campaign to transform the country from an agrarian economy to a communist society. The Great Leap Forward led to the Great Chinese Famine, that in itself led to the deaths of an estimated 45 million people. To regain ideological control, Mao enacted the Cultural Revolution to purge Chinese society of its traditional elements, or the Four Olds: old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. Inspired by Mao's desire to overturn Chinese society and make it purely communist in character, young party members called the Red Guard began a path of destruction, which began in the August of 1966, a month that is known as Red August. The first things to change were the names of streets, from innocuous names to party slogans. While the campaign began with the giving of speeches and putting up posters, publicly harassing people who defiantly demonstrated the Four Olds, especially intellectuals, was considered perfectly acceptable. The next stage was cultural destruction. Amongst the many things vandalised and destroyed was Confucius's tomb in Shandong province. Ming dynasty tombs were also burned. Personal property was stolen or trashed by the Red Guards as they entered the homes of the wealthy and destroyed anything that they viewed as part of the Four Olds, such as paintings, books, furniture, or genealogy books tracing one's ancestors. The cynical eradication of anything historical that could not be considered communist that took place in this period, all in the name of an ideology, is absolutely astounding. Another act of destroying one's own history can be seen when the Taliban took dynamite to the Buddhas of Bamyan in March 2001. They were destroyed at the behest of Mullah Omar, as the Taliban government classified them as idols and thus heresy, which was not tolerated by this branch of religious extremism. The Buddhas had been built in the 6th century AD and had stood for over 1,000 years. Today, there is only a gaping hole and the before and after photos to attest to their ever having been there. An equally famous act of iconoclasm is found during the invasion of Iraq in 2003 by coalition forces. The Battle of Baghdad eventually saw the toppling of the statue of Saddam Hussein. A local man called Kadem Sharif took a sledgehammer to the statue. Helped by US forces, he was able to bring the statue to the ground. A statue that had only stood for a single year. Interviewed in 2016, Sharif has since told the BBC that he regretted felling the statue, as there were now 1,000 men at large in Iraq, who were much more violent than Saddam had ever been. The Taliban were not the only ones to have used religious reasons to erase the history and archaeological remains of past civilizations. Forces under the black banners of ISIL or Daesh destroyed precious artifacts in the Museum of Mosul, Iraq, entire monuments in the ancient city of Palmyra, and even the older Assyrian city of Nimrud. The image here shows how, with sledgehammers and drills, statues were pummeled into dust. This satellite image of Palmyra gives us an idea of what is now left of the ancient site. Again, little but dust. Finally, the remains of Nimrud can be seen on this mobile phone compared to what remains now. A wall of stone and dust. Why? Because all idols and images were prohibited as heretical by these religious extremists. So, what do all these events tell us? Firstly, as we have seen, statues can be erected in public to commemorate the memory of certain individuals. The social structures that support those individuals frequently allow such statues and monuments to be erected. However, when the conditions allowed, such as when a new ideology threatened old traditions, or when stability racked established ideas and practices, the symbols of the power structures often come under attack. We can group the examples here into four main types. 1. Revenge or payback, such as the Greeks and Persians. 2. Religious or ideological motives and the notion of heresy, such as the Christians, Taliban, Mao's Cultural Revolution, and the Egyptians and Akhenaten. 3. The disrespect of invading armies towards other cultures' history. For example, the US and coalition forces, ISIL, ISIS or Daesh. And 4. The overthrowing of tyrants of an authoritarian regime, such as the Sons of Liberty and King George, the US forces and Saddam, and the Boudiccan Revolt. In terms of the acts of iconoclasm we have seen following the Black Lives Matter protests, we could argue that the destruction of statues in June 2020 fits into all four of these categories: revenge, heresy, disrespect, and the overthrowing of tyranny. Yet behind all of the events described in this video, we have a clear common factor. Many of the movements involved in the destruction of statues were not the acts of single individuals, but revolved around the mass of the crowd. With that in mind, a digression into the study of crowds is very useful. This will serve as the focus of part 2. If you like this video, then please like and even subscribe, because that way you won't miss out on part 2 of this series on pulling down statues. Thanks for listening.